Sometimes you just crave junk food. This might be an inherent human trait when we're sad or in need of comfort. Or perhaps a taste for sweet, fatty, unhealthy foods is ingrained in our DNA. People in medieval Europe loved their junk food. There were entire sections of towns and cities that had fast food shops whose sole purpose was to make junk food dishes. It was at these fast food joints that you could buy mystery meat pies, funnel cakes with some interesting toppings, and pretzels that would bring you good luck. Medieval junk food could be delicious, but like junk food today, it could also be hazardous to your health. Would you survive eating medieval junk food? Let's find out. For the most part, medieval diets consisted of a lot of bread. Vegetables and certain meats were available, but the lower classes, which made up most of the inhabitants of medieval Europe, could not afford any type of luxury items, including most food. During the Middle Ages, takeout food was almost exclusively eaten by lower-class people. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first was that most people were too poor to have their own hearth or oven, so they could not cook their own food. The other reason was that the ingredients they needed were not readily available to them, so these people needed to get takeout in order to meet their dietary needs. The meat pie is a perfect example of both a fast food and a junk food dish in medieval Europe. We'll be coming back to this questionable form of junk food, but basically it was meat wrapped up in bread dough and baked into a pie-like crust. Oftentimes, peasants would bring their own meat to a fast food joint known as a cook shop, or a bakery where the cook would take the meat, wrap it up in their dough, cook it, and sell it back to the customer. Cook shops with ovens had a great advantage because poor people needed to rely on them to cook their food. It was almost like they had a monopoly on cooking appliances. But even though meat pies were a favorite junk food for many, it was by no means the only type of junk food available. Some of the foods from medieval times would sound delicious, others not so much. The people of Europe in the Middle Ages had some unique tastes, but their junk food options were also confined by what was available in the region and what they could afford. Get ready to go on a culinary journey into medieval junk food. Before we talk about the sweet and savory options, it should be mentioned that most affluent people in the Middle Ages did not eat the junk food and fast food we will discuss. These dishes were for the common men and women. There are a few reasons for this, but most have to do with the lack of cleanliness at the cook shops. The ability to cook whatever they wanted at their castles and estates also meant that the wealthy landowners didn't have to venture into less desirable parts of town to get the dishes they craved. The rich wouldn't want to mingle with the poor who visited rows of cook shops, and therefore they did not partake in the same types of junk food. What was the go-to junk food of the time, you might ask? Well, it depends on what you were in the mood for. There were always a variety of options for fast food and junk food in larger towns and cities. Let's go back to the meat pies. This type of medieval junk food will likely sound good at first, but eating it had big risks. Most of the time, it was better to bring your own meat to the cook shop rather than eating what was already there. We can kind of look at meat pies as the fast food hamburgers of medieval times. They were cheap, could be found pretty much everywhere, and were filled with mystery meat. Hard-working peasants would often end their days in the fields or laboring at a shop and head to their favorite meat pie establishment for dinner. These dishes were hearty and able to fill up even the most hungry belly. The only problem was that you had to be careful about which vendors you bought your meat pies from. Some unscrupulous characters would put spoiled meat into their pies and sell them as if everything was fine. Rather than losing money on tainted meat, cookshop vendors would disguise the tainted meat within their meat pies. Customers could find themselves chowing down on meat pies and becoming sick as the spoiled meat entered their system. The meat in meat pies was normally ground up, which made mixing good meat with tainted meat easy to do, without the customer's knowledge. The type of meat varied with what was available at the time, but most times it would be pork, beef, or a combination of both. In some really shady cook shops, the proprietors would even sell meat pies that were days old, at a discount rather than just throw them away. In these circumstances, customers would leave the shop with junk food that was likely to make them very sick or worse. Even if the meat inside the pie hadn't spoiled, there was still a danger of consuming undercooked meat when eating the meat pies. There were no cooking thermometers, and busy cook shops could churn out as many pies as they could to satiate the junk food cravings of the masses. Obviously, consuming undercooked meat, especially if it's not the best quality, can lead to all kinds of problems. Meat pies were a definite favorite junk food during the Middle Ages and looked just like a thicker version of a fruit pie. But there was another piece of junk food that rivaled even this fast food favorite. Pasties were similar to meat pies, except they were folded over like a calzone instead of being baked in a circle. The meat inside would be same as the meat pies, but some preferred the pasty delivery method to the pie. But either way, both meat pies and pasties were a go-to junk food for people in medieval times, even if they occasionally got one with tainted meat inside. Although some bread might not be considered a type of junk food now, in the Middle Ages it was everywhere. However, very few people had the means to make it at home. Almost everyone during the medieval era got their bread from the local baker. It's at these shops that they could also secure other types of their favorite junk foods. Bakeries became so important to the common person that in 1350 London passed a law banning bakers from charging over a penny for meat pies when people brought their own meat. The nobles knew that if bakers were able to set their own prices, things would get out of hand very quickly. Bread was too important and too many people relied on it for their survival. It was a food staple while also being incorporated into a number of junk food dishes. Therefore, the price needed to be controlled so peasants could afford bread and meat pies, otherwise there would be a revolt. Perhaps the best example of how bread was used as a junk food was the invention of the bread bowl in the Middle Ages. These edible bowls were also called trenchers and were the ideal container for holding stews, meats, or any other type of dish that had extra juices that could be soaked up. The best part about the bread bowl was that once you were done eating what was inside it, you could eat your bowl too. It was the perfect food container for the super hungry. Bread bowls and just bread in general were consumed so often that the average carb intake of a medieval peasant was astounding. This is where the junk food part of bread comes in. Too many carbs can lead to increased blood sugar levels. The excess consumption of bread meant people in the Middle Ages likely had a high rate of heart disease. However, another carb-filled junk food was not only delicious, but also said to bring people good luck. Pretzels were often baked by monks and members of the Catholic Church as a way to raise money, and as a junk food to keep people happy. Pretzels were made from 3 simple ingredients: water, flour, and salt. During times of fasting, when devout Christians were banned from eating meat and animal products, pretzels became a junk food favorite. The more salt, the tastier the loopy dough would be. This could lead to high cholesterol, but when you crave a pretzel, your health is of little importance. Pretzels also came with an added benefit. They were considered a symbol of good luck and prosperity. And since the church baked these delicious snacks, they were a sign of spiritual well-being as well. So although the pretzels of medieval Europe might have been junk food, there was a lot of upside to eating them. This caused pretzels to become more and more popular, and variations on pretzel recipes began to sprout up across the region. Medieval junk food wasn't just composed of snacks and late-night street food. There was also a junk food that could be eaten early in the morning. During the Middle Ages, waffles were invented. Waffles, like pretzels, were produced by the church. People could find them at bake shops. However, the best waffle-type junk food were the wafers made by the Catholic Church using heated metal plates. There's some evidence that these medieval waffles even had biblical scenes pressed into them. As Crusaders came back from the Holy Land, they brought ingredients such as cinnamon and cream back with them. These delicacies were added to the waffles, making them a truly delectable form of junk food. Europeans during medieval times liked their sweets. By adding toppings and other ingredients to their waffle wafers, it became the ultimate junk food. However, it wasn't until the 15th century that the Dutch created the rectangular grid pattern that we associate with waffles today. For many during medieval times, junk food didn't necessarily have to be food. For example, during Lent, devout Catholics needed to fast. During this time, many people turned to alcohol to get them through fasting. Alcohol itself might not be a junk food, but it was used in a similar way. People would find solace in drinking alcoholic beverages to keep their minds off the food they couldn't have. Like many types of junk food, alcohol was consumed to make people feel better when times were tough. There may be no type of food more synonymous with a junk food than desserts, and people in medieval Europe loved their desserts. In fact, the word dessert dates back to the medieval era, when the French used it to mean the last course of a meal. The word dessert is thought to have been derived from the term desservi, which means to clear the table. Just like today, there are numerous types of medieval desserts that fall into the category of junk food. During this time, people enjoyed all kinds of different tarts made from fresh and preserved fruits. These snacks were obviously high in sugar content, and although they were eaten by many, some other junk foods were clear favorites. Funnel cakes were invented in the medieval era, and once they came onto the scene, people couldn't get enough of this junk food. Funnel cakes are technically a type of fritter, which was also a favorite for many people at the time. However, once bakers started frying the fritters and putting powdered sugar on top of them, people went nuts. This dish was originally called Crispies, and it wasn't as intricate as some of the funnel cakes seen at fairs and restaurants today, but their sweetness kept people coming back for more. Medieval cooks didn't have access to all the ingredients we currently have, so they had to make do with what was available. This meant that when frying their fritters, medieval bakers had to get creative to make sure their baked good was as sweet as possible. Otherwise, they wouldn't satisfy that junk food craving of their customer. The bakers put sweetened cottage cheese on the funnel cakes and called it fritter of milk. It seemed to work as people went crazy over this junk food. In other circumstances, the fritters and funnel cakes would be covered in honey or sweet fruits. The dough itself was delicious, but it was the sweetness that people craved. If there was a favorite junk food of medieval Europe, funnel cake was probably it. Things would begin to shift as time went on, but sugar was hard to come by at the beginning of the Middle Ages. This sweet substance was expensive, and it was a big turnoff for the masses who were looking to chow down on some cheap junk food. Again, if you were wealthy, you would eat whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, because you had your own fully staffed kitchen with servants. However, for the rest of the populace, they needed to get their fix of sweets from the junk food served at the cookshops and bakeries. In these situations, honey was the sweetener of choice. Fritters were coated in honey and then filled with other ingredients. Honey was substituted for sugar in pretty much every baked good until it became more plentiful and cheaper for bakers to obtain sugar. When medieval people weren't eating fritters or funnel cake, they might have been eating this next special type of bread. Gingerbread was the answer for people looking for cheap junk food that would satisfy their cravings for something filling and full of flavor. Like the fritters, gingerbread recipes used honey to bring sweetness to this junk food. The breadcrumbs would be covered in honey, stirred into a simmering pot, and then spices like ginger, cloves, and pepper would be added to give the gingerbread its spicy, sweet flavor. Today, we think of gingerbread as a holiday treat, but this was not the case in medieval times. Gingerbread was baked and consumed throughout the year. This was a quick and cheap junk food that could be found any day at a bake shop. That being said, gingerbread was probably not as popular as funnel cake or fritters, but it was a delicious alternative for people who had become tired of other junk food and wanted something a little different. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, everything changed. Sugar became more available and easier to find. This led some people to do some crazy things with the sweet substance. Perhaps the most bizarre junk food that came out of the increased accessibility of sugar was sugared meat. That's right, people literally covered their meat in sugar and ate it. This might seem gross, because it was. As more and more people had access to sugar, honey was replaced. The medieval populace developed an even sweeter tooth that could no longer be satisfied by traditional sweeteners. Sugar was added to everything. It was used to crystallize fruits and to make syrup sweeter. Funnel cakes could be an even more popular junk food now that extra sugar was added. People were putting sugar on vegetables. Literally anything they ate normally was turned into junk food, as their appetite for sugar could not be controlled. They began putting sugar on fish and other meats. This phenomenon was likely started by the rich and wealthy, but it also might have occurred in a cook shop. It's hard to imagine that heavily sugaring any type of meat would taste good, but once the sugar became readily available, it seemed there was nothing the people of Europe wouldn't try to turn into junk. It's important to note that the good times of funnel cakes and sugary desserts didn't last forever and weren't for everyone. Many of the peasants of Europe were so poor they couldn't even afford these types of junk food. For them, a dish called pottage was their meal, dessert, and snack all rolled into one. Pottage was a thick stew that contained meat, vegetables, and bran, and basically had everything someone needed to fill them up. But the dish could get old after a while. However, if you were super poor, there would be nothing you could do but eat pottage every night of the week. Many peasants hunted game in the forests of the region or saved up to purchase a sheep, cow, or a pig. Sheep and cows could provide milk, which could be drunk or used in other dishes. But if you were one of the many people who were extremely poor, junk food wasn't really a viable option. People might have saved up for months to purchase a funnel cake. Or perhaps, if they were lucky on a hunt, they could bring the meat from the kill to a cook shop for a meat pie. But this was a rare occurrence. Then there were the junk food delicacies of those who had money. The rich definitely indulged in tarts, cakes, fritters, and meat pies, but they could also afford to have more exotic tastes in junk food. Lords and ladies threw banquets to celebrate different occasions. If a king's forces won a victory in battle, there would be a banquet. If two kingdoms were brought together by a marriage between their children, a huge party would be thrown to celebrate the occasion. It's at these events that some of the craziest foods were created and eaten. These next few dishes that we'll explore will not only shock you but may make you throw up that last meal you ate, so proceed with caution. One favorite junk food dish for some people in the medieval times was sheep penis. This was not just a clever name for a recipe, it was actually what people were eating. Sheep penis would be a snack or a side dish that would consist of several severed sheep penises that had been cleaned and stuffed with the yolks of eggs. The cook would also add saffron, milk, and fat to the dish to really bring out the flavors. The whole thing would be thrown into boiling water for a brief time and then roasted over a fire. For some, this was a delicacy. For others, it was a favorite snack. You can imagine a greedy lord demanding that his cook prepare him his favorite junk food dish of sheep penis as he sat on his throne. When the sheep penises were done being roasted, they would be sprinkled with ginger, cinnamon, and pepper to give them a unique flavor and crunch. The thought of eating sheep penis might make your stomach churn, but in medieval Europe, this was a hit dish. For those who were less well off, they might be lucky enough to stumble upon a feral cat. In the streets of larger towns and villages, cats roamed the alleys and farms in search of mice and other food. If someone was able to catch a cat, there was a recipe on how to roast it in several medieval cookbooks. Most indicated that the head of the cat be cut off, because the brains were not fit for eating. It was believed anyone who consumed cat brains would lose their senses. Back then, many thought that cats were intrinsically evil, but this did not stop hungry medieval citizens from snacking on them. Recipes for roasted cat recommended that the creature be cut open and cleaned thoroughly. In order to remove any evil that might be contained within the cat itself, the feline would then be buried underground for one full day and night. Once all the preparations were complete, the cat would be soaked in broth and garlic and cooked to perfection. This might seem like a gruesome meal, but if you were too poor to buy a meat pie or bread and were able to catch a cat, it might have been your only option for survival. However, the fact that there was a recipe for roasted cats suggests that the dish was consumed relatively frequently. This next medieval dish could be considered 2 meals in one, as it was made by sewing 2 different animals together. The cockentrice was a medieval concoction that combined a rooster and a pig. The chef would cook each creature and then saw them in half. He would then sew the top of the rooster to the bottom of the pig and put it on a skewer. This created a dish that looked like it came out of a fairy tale or a horror story, depending on who you asked. But the cockentrice dish didn't end with the sewing together of 2 animals. The half-rooster, half-pig concoction was then stuffed with different ingredients, covered in egg yolk and saffron, and cooked over a flame to give the skin of the creatures a nice crisp. The cockentrice was only consumed by the wealthy, as it was a very special meal that was incredibly time-consuming and could only be made correctly by a talented chef. A junk food that was slightly rarer but consumed by both rich and poor during medieval times was the humble pie. This dish was similar to a meat pie but was normally reserved for holidays and celebrations. Humble pie consists of dough stuffed with the entrails of deer and other wild animals. This meant the peasants and poorer citizens would need to hunt for their own ingredients to make humble pies. After a good hunt, the meat of a deer or wild boar would be cooked and either consumed or preserved by a medieval family. However, the entrails could be brought to a cook shop, where the baker would stuff them into dough and create an humble pie. Like with most of the junk food dishes in the Middle Ages, the humble pie probably wasn't cooked at home, as most people didn't have ovens. However, during this time, it seems that people would go out of their way to have humble pie during certain times of the year. Like with meat pies, it was probably best to bring the entrails of animals that you or someone you knew personally hunted and killed. Because if you left it up to the chefs at the cook shop, you never know how old the entrails actually were or what type of animal you were eating. Now watch what you weren't told about medieval executioners, or check out why you wouldn't survive in medieval time.